Well, hello. In this video we're going to be looking at quadratic functions. Before we can look at quadratic functions and all the work that we have to do with them, we first need to review completing the square. We're going to be using the skill of completing the square in this lesson, so it's best if we just take a look at some problems. Alright, here's our first quadratic equation. It's in general form, meaning it's solved for 0. 0's on one side of the equation. So when this equation is in general form, we can complete the square. Okay, our first step is to move the constant to the other side, leaving the variable terms on the left. We left a blank, so we're going to add 6 to both sides. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to try and fill in this blank here. So we take half of b and square it. And again, a is 1, b is 2, and c is actually in general form is negative 6. But to fill in the blank, we've got to take half of b and square it. Oop, I need a b in there. So half of 2 is 1. Square it, you get 1. Okay, if I'm going to add a 1 to the left side of the equation, I've got to come over here and add a 1 to the right side of the equation. Okay, next line down, we can factor. This will factor into a binomial square. Okay, the next move is to extract the square roots. I'm going to rewrite the problem. I'm going to bring in the square root. And remember, because we have an even power and an even root, we bring out the absolute value. Bring down the square root of 7. Remove the absolute value, but when you do so, you have to adjust and put a plus minus here. We're finished when we isolate x, so we're going to subtract 1, and we usually put the negative 1, or the result of, simplifying and isolating x, we put it in front of the plus minus. So negative 1 plus minus square root of 7. So your two solutions are negative 1 plus the square root of 7 and negative 1 minus the square root of 7. You can write them out individually, or you can leave the answers doubled up. Okay, let's do another completing the square. X squared plus x minus 1 equals 0. Okay, the quadratic equation is in general form. Okay, but let's isolate the variable terms, leave a blank, move the 1 over. That is a 1, kind of looks like a 7. Okay, half of b and square it. Okay, well, half of 1, which is b, would be a half, and you want to square that. Squaring a half gives a fourth. So I'm including a plus 1/4 that wasn't there before, so I have to include it on the right side of the equation. Alright, factoring into a binomial square gives x, and it's always half of b that belongs in the binomial. So half of b would be positive 1/2. Let's come over here and get a common denominator of 4. So we can rewrite 1 whole as 4 over 4. Collecting gives 5/4. I'm going to rewrite the problem so it's not crowded. I'm going to bring in the square root on both sides of the equation. Because it's an even, not an odd root, I bring out the radicand with an absolute value. What I can do here is I can simplify. I have square root of 5 over the square root of 4, but the square root of 4 is 2. Let's remove the absolute value. The result is positive negative square root of 5 over 2. To isolate the x, we're going to subtract a half. We're finished. If you notice that you have a common denominator, you could rewrite the solutions as a single fraction. You could put both the fractions over just 1, 2, negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 5. Okay, so we needed to review completing the square. Our work with reviewing completing the square is not done, but the next two examples are going to have us look at a little different situation. Notice that in example 1 and 2, both these examples, a's value was 1. That makes completing the square as easy as it's going to get, Well, what happens when a is not 1? In our next two examples, we're going to see when a is not 1 and what additional step we have to do to complete the process of completing the square. So two more examples where a is not 1 in completing the square. Alright, so here we are with example 3. Notice that the objective is to complete the square. Okay, notice that a is not 1. But we begin the process the same way we do when a is 1. Okay, except for I'm not going to put the blank down just yet. Okay, I'm going to move the 3 over, make it -3. Okay, the additional move that we have to do that was mentioned is that we need to factor out a 2 so that a is 1. So with our remaining two terms that are over here on the left, the next move is to factor out a 2 from both terms to create a equals 1. Okay, check your work by distributing. Yes, that gets back here. Now only when a is 1 can we put in that blank that we're going to have to fill in. So not bad, just additionally factor out when a is not 1. Okay, proceed as before, take half of b and square it. Alright, well, b is currently 4, divided by 2, that's 2, square it and get 4. Okay, the second thing that we have to adjust for is this. We don't want to just come over here and add 4, because what's happening is we're actually going to have to multiply 2 by 4, and what we've added that wasn't here previous was 8. So the additional step after you factor out the 2 is to go back and multiply it in to what you filled in the blank. Take the result of that product, which is going to be 8, and add that to the other side. Okay, now we can just proceed. Keep the 2 in front, it is a factor. Factor the trinomial into a binomial square. Collect over here, that's 5. Before we can complete the square, we need to divide by 2. Okay, so we're going to divide both sides by 2. Okay, because you can't bring in the square root until you've isolated the binomial square. Okay, so it's not going to make it pretty, but that's okay. So now the result is quantity x plus 2 squared equals 5/2. I'm going to write the problem down again so that I can bring in the square root. Okay, so now absolute value x plus 2 square root of 5/2. Neither 5 nor 2 is a perfect square. Okay, so I can't simplify or bring anything out. Okay, my last move is to remove the absolute value, which makes it, or not my last move, second to last move. Okay, is going to be positive negative square root of 5/2. Now my last move is to subtract the 2. Negative 2 plus or minus radical 5/2. So we had a couple additional steps that we had to do because a was not 1. So let's do one more example of that just to get some continuity. Alright, so here's example 4. We're going to go ahead and continue practicing completing the square when a is not 1. We need this skill in the lesson that we're going to be doing. So I thought it'd be best if we kind of pulled this skill outside of the lesson. Alright, let's complete the square. Okay, since a is not 1, don't leave a blank. Move over the 1. Okay, now factor out the 2 to create a equals 1. But now you can add the blank, equals -1. So there was our first step, is pulling out the 2 if a was not 1. Alright, half of b squared. b is -2. Half of that would be -1 squared. It's going to be +1. Okay, don't just add 1 over here. Remember, we need to first multiply by 2, so that result is 2, so that's what we're going to add over here. Alright, keep the 2 in front, or whatever the number is that you factored out. Factor this trinomial into a binomial square. Remember, this is always half of b. Before you square it, this is half of b. The result of adding here is 1. Okay, we're going to divide both sides by 2 before we bring the square root in. Okay, I'm going to rewrite the problem. I think you see where this is going. I'm going to bring in the radical. Absolute value of x minus 1. Okay, notice that the square root of 1 is just 1. You could bring that out as just 1 and leave the square root of 2 in the denominator. Let's not worry about rationalizing getting a square root out of the denominator in this lesson. We got our hands full with everything else. Sometimes it's okay to leave a radical in the denominator, and for our bigger picture, it's okay in this lesson. Remove the absolute value, plus minus 1 over square root of 2. Let's add a 1. Okay, that's our final answer right there if we didn't want to rationalize the square root of 2. So I would box that and say, you know what, we're finished. But just as a reminder, if you were going to rationalize, if you'd forgotten, to get the square root out of the denominator, we multiply by the square root of 2 over 2. So an additional answer that might be what some would consider more simplified, but we're not going to worry about it, is that we're going to have square root of 2 over this product down here would just result in 2. Okay, so I'm fine with you guys just leaving your answer unrationalized right here. Alright, so I wanted to do these review problems before we jumped inside of our lesson so that when we do encounter a situation where we have to complete the square and a is not 1, I won't have to stop and teach about it right then. We've got familiarity with it.